evening with us at this Q&A, Know Your Rights, Navigating Gender Affirming Care in the Current Moment. My name is Tre'Andre Valentine. My pronouns are they, them, theirs, and he, him, his, and I am the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Transgender Political Coalition, and I will be moderating / facilitating this, this Q&A tonight. If folks have any questions as our presenters are talking or as they're asking questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and we'll get to them as much as we can. And I think that's all of the housekeeping bits for right now. If anything comes up, folks having a hard time hearing or accessing anything, just put that in the chat and we'll get to that as soon as possible. Okay, so the reason we wanted to bring this together was that a lot of folks have questions about what's going on currently, how to navigate accessing affirming healthcare. And so GLAAD and MTPC and the Massachusetts Transgender Health Coalition came together to do this online Q&A to answer folks' questions. And there's been a lot of confusion recently regarding the federal administration ruling or upcoming ruling on Section 1557, which we will have some of our experts talk about in a little bit. And that this could put a lot of that the Section 1557 of the Affordable Health Care Act incorporates protections from existing civil rights laws. And that is definitely in jeopardy with the current federal administration. And so some folks may have questions about that, may be nervous about that. And what we wanted to do is to reassure you that regardless of what the ruling is, that Massachusetts has a non-discrimination law, and that in theory, the law is on our side, but what happens is where the breakdown happens is in practice and in impersonal interaction. And so we need to, people can follow the intent of the law without following the law. People can follow the law without following the intent of the law. And the intent of the law is really about the safety and well-being of trans people in all aspects of life. And so some of the things that we've been hearing from community members about what's going on is nothing actually new, right? In this moment, it's really just been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. And what we're hearing is even though Massachusetts prohibits discrimination in healthcare, folks are still being denied access. There's still a lack of trans competent professionals, healthcare professionals, and people are experiencing violence. And so these are being exacerbated, and this is just the COVID-19 pandemic is really just highlighting these issues and these disparities like we're seeing everywhere else. And so with that being said, I want to introduce Jennifer, who is from GLAAD and will be presenting on the legal aspects of things.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tre'Andre. And it really is an honor to be on this panel, and appreciate all the folks that pulled this together. I am the director of GLAAD's Transgender Rights Project. And I wanted to say a few things about the national landscape that Tre'Andre referred to before we get into the nitty-gritty and some more local focus on navigating healthcare access, particularly at this time. We have made tremendous strides over the last decade or so in adding trans-specific protections to laws, certainly at the state level, and with respect to many local policies as well, including by private companies, different government agencies, schools, districts, et cetera. But the pandemic also hits at a time when there has been an effort at the national level to roll back rights for transgender people. Many of you know that we are awaiting an important decision from the United States Supreme Court on whether federal employment law will continue to protect transgender people. And that decision and the accompanying ones addressing the same question for LGBT people will be very consequential, both because of what they'll mean to interpretation of other important laws like federal education non-discrimination law, known as Title IX. In the cases I'm talking about relate to Title VII, employment law, but also with respect to the scope of the Affordable Care Act. And I want to say a couple of things about that. So, in terms of the Affordable Care Act, I wanted to give a broad description of the lay of that land. So the ACA contains a very important non-discrimination statute, oftentimes referred to as Section 1557. That's maybe how people have heard it referred to, because that's the code section where the non-discrimination provision lives. And during the last administration, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, interpreted that provision to clearly protect transgender people against discrimination in access to healthcare. HHS also made clear that based on its interpretation of Section 1557, most insurance plans cannot deny care, including coverage of particular treatments relating to someone being transgender. So the HHS rule was a very important part in motivating a number of states, including Massachusetts, to issue insurance guidelines that have resulted in more expansive coverage for transgender people. We know, of course, that not all insurance providers are complying with HHS's interpretation of law. And I know that Andrew is going to talk in some more specific detail later on in the program about ways to address insurance denials. But also just to mention, in fact, based on the fact that not everyone is complying, GLAAD actually has a current lawsuit on behalf of a hospice worker against his employer for denying any insurance coverage for gender transition related medical care. And so I just want to say, if anyone has or knows someone with an insurance plan that excludes coverage for care, to please reach out to GLAAD Answers, and maybe we can put that information in the chat about how to do that for anyone who doesn't know. But shifting back to the ACA and Section 1557 for the moment, this administration has signaled its intention to change HHS's interpretation of that law, the non-discrimination law, including by excluding transgender people from the scope of that provision. So we've seen drafts of that. The government has released those drafts, and we know that they have been advanced through the Department of Justice. So there hasn't been a final change in the rule, but we do expect to hear about that any time now. I do want to point out, as Tre'Andre said as well, that of course it's the law, that is the statute, that ultimately controls the scope of coverage, not the federal agency's interpretation of it. But the activity on the part of this administration is very troubling, something we're closely following, and something unfortunately that's really consistent with the administration's general approach to rolling back rights on for the community. So at the state level, I do want to note that Massachusetts law, in fact, as probably most of you know, the laws throughout the 6 New England states are very specific in their coverage of transgender people in our non-discrimination laws. So I do want to mention that our state public accommodation law does mean that in most circumstances, the denial of medical care or refusal to provide medical services to transgender people by hospitals, doctors, healthcare clinics, et cetera, is a violation of state law. And that will be true and remain true regardless of any change by HHS in its interpretation of federal law. But as Tre'Andre said, it's really about what we can do to ensure compliance with those laws that we want to get more deeply into today. And so with that, and I'm happy, we're going to hopefully leave plenty of time for questions. So if people have questions on kind of the broad scope of both state, national law, and some of the shifts, some of the really unfortunate shifts that we're seeing, I'm happy to address those more specifically. So back to you, Tre'Andre.
Thanks, Jennifer. I appreciate that. Next, I'd like to introduce Aleah Nesteby, who is a nurse practitioner at Oxbow with Cooley Dickinson and is the director of LGBTQ services.
Nice to see everybody. So I was asked to give a little bit of a perspective on what's been going on medically for folks, or at least kind of what people are running into or worries that I'm hearing from a medical standpoint around folks and gender transition or their experience of being a trans person in the medical system right now at this moment in time. There's been a lot of stuff going on, nothing that is particularly new. Like Tre'Andre was saying, a lot of the stuff is kind of more of the same or a little bit like of an exacerbation of the same problems that people are facing. But one of the things that was kind of unique and definitely big for lots of folks was that when the pandemic started and everything started shutting down, one of the things that happened was that hospitals canceled or postponed elective surgical procedures. So this could be really anything from, you know, like a joint replacement to having your like deviated septum fixed. But for many trans people, they were scheduled already to have surgery like top surgery or bottom surgery, and those got postponed as well because they fall into a category of surgeries that are considered to be non-emergent. So what ended up happening for a lot of folks was that their surgery was postponed for kind of an indefinite amount of time because we can't really answer for people when are things going to reopen. There are some places that are starting to reopen for elective procedures, and then there's a lot of conversations going on kind of behind the scenes about how is the best way to do this, so that it is being discussed in a lot of healthcare systems, especially in the Northeast. But I know that a lot of people were kind of left hanging with a lot of plans they had made that were sort of like forced suddenly to be sort of like completely scuttled. So that's one thing, was the surgical disruption. Other things we're seeing have to do a little more with things like people not being able to get out of the house. So things like picking up medication from pharmacies has been a problem. One thing that people may not know is that Mass Health is allowing people to get up to 90 days of prescriptions at a time, which is different than their usual regulation, which is 30 days at a time. So some people have been able to get more of the medication that they needed, which has been good. But on the other hand, testosterone is a controlled substance. That's only dispensed 30 days at a time. And my understanding from talking to pharmacists is that that has not changed with the change in the Mass Health regulations. So people may be able to get 90 days at a time of something like spironolactone, but still only 30 of testosterone. So that's been distressing for folks that don't necessarily want to keep going out to the pharmacy. There's also just things that we've been seeing that I think affect people throughout the healthcare system. So loss of wages, unemployment, transportation being really suddenly very erratic or unobtainable because people were depending on other people in their family or in the community for rides. We are starting to do virtual visits. So we were doing phone visits. Now we're doing video visits with people, which has been helpful. But again, there's kind of an economic and a access factor there. So if you don't have an ability to do a Zoom visit, then you can't do a Zoom visit. If you don't have a phone that's on, you can't do a telephone visit. So those things have also had an impact on folks. I think that also there's the larger issues too of social isolation, which can be really challenging for people if chosen family is who you surround yourself with, and suddenly if you are removed from most of those people that were in your life on a frequent basis. I think people are doing a pretty good job of reaching out and trying to stay in touch and using all the technology things that we have to our advantage. But I do think that we're hearing a lot from people that they're just feeling like lonely and sad and isolated, and it's hard to like not see people that you thought you would see. So, and I'm happy to answer any questions that I can answer about things like medication or surgical access or anything else that you can think of.
Thanks, Aleah. And one of the things that when this pandemic broke, that what the Massachusetts Trans Health Coalition did was to put together a sort of tip sheet um, for navigating gender affirming care during this time. And so I put it in the link that really quickly we did one specifically for trans, non-binary, and gender diverse patients, where we were trying to reassure that, to hang in there, to stay connected as much as possible, that we understand that having things canceled and postponed can be really devastating and can really have an impact on our mental health. What are the things that you should know, knowing your rights, and things to be aware of in terms of keeping a safe distance, making sure you wash your hands thoroughly, staying indoors as much as possible, wearing a face covering. And in addition to that, we had one for providers as well as one for insurers. And you can find that, again, the link is in the chat. So just wanted to highlight that really quickly before I introduce Andrew.
Hi, everybody. I'm really happy to be here with you this evening. My name's Andrew Cohen. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm an attorney at Health Law Advocates. Health Law Advocates is a nonprofit law firm. We're based in Boston, but we serve people across the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, from the Berkshires to the Cape and everywhere in between. We focus on access to healthcare and access to health coverage, with specialized expertise in helping people troubleshoot barriers to care. Particularly, I lead a project focused on helping trans and non-binary people and gender expansive people access gender affirming care. So our Transgender Health Initiative focuses on both individualized representation as well as policy work in trainings for the community and for healthcare providers and other folks as well. And what I'd like to say is, during this COVID moment, obviously there have been more barriers that have put up, that people have encountered in terms of access to care. But there are some of the same barriers as well. Over the past several years, actually just a few years ago, 5-6 years ago, there were very few health insurance plans that actually covered gender affirming care. So we really have seen a sea change, both in Massachusetts and beyond, of health insurance plans covering these very much needed services, including surgeries, hormone treatment, and other kinds of gender affirming care. And what Health Law Advocates has done is we help individuals who are facing denials by insurance, whether it's private health insurance or if it's Medicaid or Mass Health. We help people troubleshoot these issues and actually appeal denials to their coverage. So Mass Health only started really covering gender affirming care in a concerted way beginning in 2015. Our private health insurance in Massachusetts, in 2014, the Division of Insurance released a bulletin with information for fully insured health insurance plans that required them to be covering gender affirming care. Now, that doesn't mean that all private plans have to do this. What it means that private plans in Massachusetts that are regulated by Massachusetts law have to comply. But there's a lot of different health insurance plans that aren't necessarily regulated by Massachusetts law. Now, that's because there are both fully insured plans, which are regulated by Massachusetts, and what's called self-insured plans, often employer-sponsored plans that are run by big companies, where it's the company itself that takes on the risk of insuring the employees. And those plans have to abide by federal law. Now, many of those plans aren't the same kinds of protections under federal law. And we could see further erosion given what's happening with this federal administration, as Jennifer Levi was discussing. So I would be very happy to speak with, to answer any and all questions you might have around navigating barriers to care, issues within health insurance, within mass health, within private health insurance, because really the bread and butter of our work is helping individuals get the care that they need. And so if you have questions about your own plan or about you know, a friend or family member's health plan, or how to get the care that they need, you could either ask today, certainly, but you can also contact my organization and set up an intake. We help people earning up to 300% of the federal poverty level. So people who are lower income, or I like to say lower middle income. So we can't help everybody. But if you contact us, we may be, and you are a bit higher income, we may be able to do a brief consult with you. So with that, I'd be very happy to answer questions that you might have.
Okay, great. So thank you, Andrew. While folks may be still thinking of questions, don't forget you can populate that in the chat. But we did have some questions through the RSVP, so we'll get started. Actually, before that, Aleah, did you want to do any additions to what you?
Sure, yes, there was a couple things I forgot. One thing that I wanted to mention also with access issues is that it's been much harder to get live interpreters in. So I work at Cooley Dickinson, which is a small community hospital. We are lucky to have this sort of virtual interpreter system where you can roll like an iPad type device into a room and have a video connection, a video relay service with an interpreter. So that's been great, especially in these times. But somebody, for example, who is deafblind and needs a live interpreter to interpret for them, that's been very hard. So that would be something that might be a real challenge to get. The other thing I wanted to mention that's been a common question is about lab testing. So I have, myself and other providers have lots of patients that are due for labs for things like hormone monitoring, and people have a lot of concerns about, you know, is it safe to go for lab work? Should I go into the hospital for lab work? What should I do now? What I've been telling people is, I think it's getting safer and safer as time goes by. Like the hospitals we've really stepped up our game on the sanitizing, disinfecting. I think we have a better idea now of how to assess risk for transmission for COVID-19. And so I think that it is safe to go in and get care. But also, if people are feeling well and just need routine lab work, we're telling people to, you know, you don't have to go in right this second to get the lab work done. You can go in a couple weeks. You can see how June is looking. But I do also want to just reassure people that I do think it is safe to access medical care when it's needed. So I know that's been a big fear for people also. There was also a question about how to get the 90-day supply of medication through the pharmacy with Mass Health. It's actually really easy because your provider doesn't even have to write a prescription for 90 days. Apparently, this is what I'm told from the pharmacies, that if the prescription is for 30 days but has enough refills that it would last at least 90 days. So for example, a 30-day prescription with 5 refills is 6 months worth. So they could give you 90 days off that, and then you would still have 90 days left. So apparently the pharmacists can do this on their own. When I'm doing refills as per request, I'm trying to do them for 90 days now because I know that it's doable or gettable. And one other question that I was just asked was about transition related surgery and sort of how to try to access that again. How to get, basically like, how do we decide who's priority, or how do we get that ball rolling again to get people through? I think that every institution is going to have a very different process. A lot of it is kind of out of the surgeon's hands because a lot of it is having to do with the institution or even the state having regulations around reopening and when that can happen, when that can't. So if the hospital is not open to elective procedures, then the surgeon can't really do anything about it. But at the same time, I have been also privy to discussions around things like, you know, what if there is a person who the gender affirming surgery is really the difference between life and death for them versus somebody else who is kind of like, this sucks, but I'll wait. How do we weigh that? And I think that there's not an easy answer to that, but I do think that as things open more, hopefully we can have people talk to their surgeons. And if there are people where it really is just critical for them to move forward with surgery, I would like to think that people's offices and surgeons will take that into account as much as they can. I just think it's sometimes a little bit hard for the individuals to kind of go over the institutional regulations that we see. But I do know that a lot of people are very sensitive to this, and they're aware that that's coming up for people as an issue.
Thanks, Aleah. So a question we have in the chat is, are we finding access to health disparities in the transgender community by race and ethnicity? Does anyone want to take that on? Andrew, Jennifer?
I can mention a few things. You know, I don't have all the data at my fingertips, but it is my understanding that absolutely there are, not surprisingly, you know, racial and ethnic disparities in this area. You know, I think because of the history of this country, the way that far too often lack of access to opportunity, lack of access to wealth, and, you know, lower incomes have can align with racial identities because of the history of this country, both present and past. You know, there are also health disparities generally among people of color versus, you know, white populations in this country. And you see that also when it comes to access to gender affirming care, unfortunately. And that's something that I think we all need to really focus on, and we really need to do work to flatten out those disparities so that there aren't those kinds of disparities. And it's incumbent upon all of us to, particularly, you know, people in the medical field, people in insurance companies, you know, lawyers like myself, we should all be fighting to eliminate disparities the best that we can.
And thank you. I agree with Andrew that, you know, undoubtedly we will see that. I do want to mention that there is a bill currently pending that would be very important to support, and folks could reach out, and I'll try to get the information in the chat during the time of this Q&A, but there's a bill pending that would actually require the collection of the data with regard to testing for the LGBTQ community. And that's, to my understanding, not happening in any organized way. So being able to really follow the demographic trends and figure out the communities that are being hit would require at this point legislation. And you know, as folks may well know, there was even a significant delay in collecting race and gender demographics in terms of testing and mortality rates as well. So making sure that we have all of that data is really essential to having a deep understanding of the who's being hit by this pandemic, and also will be really significant in terms of ensuring appropriate resources across the hardest hit communities.
Okay, we've got another question in the chat. So this one says, healthcare providers often treat informed consent as essential in creating a patient-centered healthcare experience. Yet in practice, the term amounts to a token gesture, little more than a one-time consent form to avoid legal liability and perhaps a running narrative of "I'm going to" statements during a medical exam. How can medical providers ensure that informed consent involves substantive actions to help trans people make fully informed choices in order to navigate the healthcare system, such as education on an array of treatment options, informing patients of their right to have an advocate present or request accompaniment by another staff member during a medical exam or visit, discussing intended and adverse effects of prescription drugs and risk of surgical procedures, and continuous check-ins to ensure ongoing consent throughout provider-patient interactions.
I can speak to one aspect of that question. I think it's a really important question. And I really think it goes to the issue of cultural competency within the provider community. And while there are some providers, you know, Aleah Nesteby is a great example, who are absolutely culturally competent and really committed to working with trans and gender nonconforming people. far too often, I think there isn't enough cultural competency within healthcare providers. I think there needs to be a lot more training for both medical providers in terms of nurses and doctors and the people delivering care, but also for frontline staff, because frontline staff are the people who you're first in touch with when you go to a healthcare provider. It's the people that you encounter, behind the desk. And, that's where some negative interactions can begin. And I think it is so important for all levels, from administration to the doctors to the frontline line staff, receive this kind of training. But then this whole idea of informed consent also goes to what kind of systems are in place that are culturally competent, not just individual interactions, but also making sure that there are appropriate systems. So informed consent is one such system. And I think these kinds of forms, we need to really look at them and try to understand how can they be better used in order to ensure better access, as opposed to just being, just a box you check, or, something that isn't contemplating, access really as its core. Because in the end, access to care is what's really key and what we're really trying to promote. I don't know, Aleah, if you have other things to comment on in terms of informed consent.
I feel like I have a lot of comments, and I'm going to try to keep it very brief because I'm trying to be conscious of the time. But I think that there's sort of two layers there. So one is the trans competency, or the sort of knowledge around gender identity, how we treat people, how we should approach people, what we should ask people. But then there's also this sort of foundational layer, I think, where medicine often doesn't do a good job with anybody of doing things like telling people the side effects of their medication, or giving people, accurate prognosis for stuff. Like I think that medicine as a whole has to kind of redo itself. We have to kind of give up the idea that we have ownership over people's bodies and that we can do what we want with people's bodies, which is a whole another thing I could talk about for a long time. And I think that some of that stuff is not trans specific at all. And it's just more of like something that would require a sea change around how people are taught to interact with folks. That being said, that's a huge thing to do, and it doesn't really help the now. So I think that encouraging people to bring advocates with them to visits is always helpful. So if people are really anxious or worried that they're going to forget something, or they're not going to take notes, or they won't remember things, it's totally fine to bring a friend, bring a family member. I've had people have people on the phone. We've done conference calls. Like, there's lots of ways that we can increase people's support during visits. And then I think, like you had mentioned, training is really critical. And I think that not only in trans care, which is also very important, but just sort of training in general around access, and how do we sort of truly meet people where they're at and work with people to find solutions for their health.
And
I just wanted to add really quickly, if I could. I mean, I think honestly what we see more are barriers that are created to access, or heightened requirements for continued or initiated treatment because of the misunderstanding about the medical need for people for gender transition related care, and because of older rejected understandings around that medical need. So just wanted to make it clear that we really oftentimes see heightened barriers, more so than even equal informed consent requirements.
And speaking of training, one of the things that MTPC has, well, one of the things we did recently was a community needs assessment. And out of this community needs assessment, it really highlighted just how much healthcare, healthcare facilities, frontline staff, basically anyone concerned with healthcare and mental health really need training. And I think this is also where the work of MTPC, where we can also come in, because the work of MTPC is to continue to advocate for non-discrimination, to continue to educate the public, state, local businesses, establishments. And so one of the things that we will be looking to in MTPC's future is actually doing a lot more targeted and concentrated training and support for healthcare. Okay, so we've got another question in the chat. Can presenters address implications of the new federal rule on 1557 for trans folks who are also sick and disabled, people of color, immigrants, have a limited English proficiency, and also people seeking / accessing abortion care? My understanding is the new DHHS rule is going to affect all of these folks, so not just queer and trans folks.
I'm happy to address that question. So 1557 is really about non-discrimination protections. So the Obama administration framed the rule in terms of protecting transgender populations, really looking at the definition of sex and applying that much more broadly to, as it should be, to gender identity and expression. And that was really only one piece of the rule. There's also another piece of the rule that focuses on access to language accessibility. And in particular, people who are limited English proficient, or LEP, ensuring that there is access to a whole range of different things in terms of access to care. Basically trying to ensure that being limited English proficient wasn't a barrier to getting the care that people needed. Now, perhaps unsurprisingly, what the Trump administration is really proposing to do is not only strip out the protections for trans and gender nonconforming people out of this rule in terms of redefining what they mean by sex as being much more focused on, what you're assigned at birth, which, we think is not appropriate or accurate in terms of the law and the reading of the law. But they're also stripping out these protections for limited English proficient people. Now, what the Trump administration is proposing to protect and really has really focused what I've seen of the rule on this area is religious organizations. And so trying to protect people based on basically from religious, what they call religious discrimination. And from my reading of that, what it really is doing in essence is setting up a system where people can use religion as a way to discriminate, and particularly when it comes to abortion care and in women's health services and reproductive health services in terms of abortion, but also contraception. And basically reframing the rule much more with that focus, as opposed to focused on non-discrimination protections for transgender nonconforming folk, as well as limited English proficient populations. So it is really problematic on the changes that the Trump administration is proposing to this rule are problematic on a broad array of bases, not just because of the way it redefines sex. And I don't know, Jennifer, if you wanted to add anything to that.
No, that sounds right. And there's a lot, anyway, you're right in terms of identifying what we are seeing around this administration's expansion of exemptions for religious institutions from complying with laws across a range of contexts.
Next question in the chat is, with less access to gender affirming care, has there been an equal level of difficulty getting additional mental health coverage during COVID?
I could field that one. I think the short answer is yes, but I think that the longer answer is that it's always very hard to find trans affirming competent therapists who take your insurance and have openings and have a schedule that works with yours, because it's very rare to, even in areas with a lot of therapists, to find that. But I think in the current pandemic situation, yeah, it's been harder for folks. One, because anyone who is taking new patients may be more restricted now, and taking newer folks, they might have different schedules. people need to have access to technology in order to do remote therapy, so Zoom or phone. So that's a problem sometimes for folks. And then in terms of people, I had some folks that were trying to find therapists that could write them evaluation letters to meet the insurance requirements for surgery, for gender affirming surgery. And I think that has sort of ground to a halt for people, just because it's been harder to find people that are available and still taking new folks. I think from a institutional standpoint, in terms of inpatient treatment, I've talked to some peers in the psych field and like various places in Massachusetts, and people have noticed that in the beginning of the pandemic, the census, meaning the amount of beds that were full, was down in a lot of places. I think a lot of people, if they were feeling super depressed or having a really hard time, they were kind of like, I also don't want to go into a hospital, so I'm going to just try to hang on a little bit longer and not go. And I think we're kind of seeing now this point where a lot of people can't quite hold on anymore because they've been trying to stay out for a long time. So we're starting to see another rise in people having kind of significant crisis level stuff going on. But for a while there, I think the entire hospital was kind of emptied out, and that included some of the psych beds, which are usually full.
I just wanted to add one more thing to that. I fully agree with what Aleah is talking about. One way in which access has potentially improved during COVID, but hasn't necessarily in practice, but one positive element of the response to the COVID pandemic has been implementation of telehealth services on kind of a faster track than it was ever going to be implemented before. And I think there's still a lot of problems in terms of access to telehealth, in terms of who has access to that technology, how it's really being used. But I do think in general, it's a very positive thing for the system as a whole to be increasing accessibility and coverage for telehealth visits, including for mental health.
I had a question actually in follow up to that, Tre'Andre, if you don't mind.
Sure.
My asking either to Aleah or Andrew, and that is whether telehealth has also created more access for transgender people to transgender competent care. So I know for particularly people outside of, some of the, outside of the Boston area and maybe outside of the Northampton area, it's been more difficult for people to find trans competent healthcare. And I'm curious to hear if, because I've heard anecdotally that has allowed for greater access, including across state lines for both diagnoses, but also access to hormones. And so I'm curious if you would have a recommendation for people to reach out beyond kind of typical providers to get more access through telehealth.
I do think it has had a positive impact, partially for distance reasons, and then partially because there are some reasons in medicine that we might see people that we really don't need to see people in person. So for example, depression follow-ups, if I'm following up with somebody after starting a new medication for depression, most of that visit, even when I see people in office, is just spent talking. Like there are visits around like depression follow-up, certain types of medication follow-up where I don't do much of an exam. It's just really about how people are feeling. So those translate very well onto platforms like Zoom or doing telehealth phone visits. And so I think those folks tend to be glad that they don't have to make the schlep into the office. One thing that I have learned from my institution is that there is some regulations around reimbursement across state lines. So I see a kind of large group of college students, and when all the colleges closed, a lot of my patients ended up going into different states as they had to go home away from college. And so there's some restrictions on how you can bill or who can bill for that. So I would just say to people who if you're under the insurance plan, just check to make sure if you're seeing a provider out of state that's going to be reimbursed, because it's tricky. I don't even fully understand it.
Yeah, so I just want to definitely make a plug that if you're going to see somebody, make sure that they're in your insurance network, because you could be on the hook for paying for the visit if they're not in your insurance network. One other small thing I wanted to mention is, this whole requirement to get 2 letters for certain surgeries, particularly gender affirming genital surgeries. It may actually fall afoul of mental health parity laws. And that's something that my organization is interested in looking into and even challenging potentially. So if this is something that some of you might have an interest in, I would love to talk with you more about it.
Great. So we are scheduled till 6:30, but since we started late, we'll be going till about 6:40, 6:45 or so. So if folks want to continue to stay on for a little longer, we would appreciate that. So the next question I have is, too often, transgender patients' self-advocacy in their health care is met with retaliation, denials of care, and even physical or sexual violence. How do you recommend that healthcare providers respond when their patients are retaliated against for advocating for themselves and denied care, or further discriminated against, assaulted, or abused? Anybody want to respond to that?
It's a tough question, and I'm happy also to hear, Leah's thoughts from a medical provider perspective. It's a very, it's a challenging circumstance and something that we certainly hear about. The non-discrimination laws are kind of a blunt instrument that don't often redress the real and serious harms that people experience. So to the extent that someone is assaulted, certainly if there's any physical assault, there's also criminal avenues available to pursue those concerns, in addition to potential non-discrimination laws that could be discrimination complaints that could be filed at the Mass Commission Against Discrimination. But I want to really a complaint to the Oversight Board for a medical provider is another place to turn. But none of those are all ways to address the problem that you raise after the fact. And so I don't want to suggest that they're in any way, approaches that are going to ultimately resolve those kind of problems that people face. I don't know if Aleah or Andrew have other thoughts on that question.
I think that it's a pervasive issue, and so I don't think that there's anything I could offer in like 30 seconds that would be a really a solution that would be permanent. But I do want to put out there that medical institutions read the letters that they get, the complaint letters that they get, and they tend to take them very seriously. So I sometimes will get people who sort of reach out from the community with concerns about something that happened to them. And I can, go to a different provider and I can talk to people one-on-one, or I can offer trainings, but I actually think it's good to put something in writing to a medical institution. And usually the bigger institutions will have basically a department, a patient experience department. They sometimes call them guest services. Oftentimes there's a website that has the procedures for how to make a complaint, and it has some of the information that Jennifer Levi was talking about in terms of how to complain at sort of the state level or to the board. But I also just want to let people know that writing a letter is old fashioned, but it does get looked at, and almost always people respond to it in some way, versus sometimes things like putting a comment on the provider satisfaction surveys that they call you with after a medical visit. Like, the provider sees those, but that doesn't necessarily always go up the chain. So it's never a bad idea to put anything positive or negative in writing into the institution.
And additionally, MTPC can also be an entity that can advocate for folks. And so if you are experiencing mistreatment or anything like that, you will feel free to reach out to us.
And can I just underscore that, Tre'Andre, because MTPC has been such an important collector of those stories over the years. And, you know, so folks know there are really important opportunities to do education with those institutions, but also to do legislative advocacy on occasion as well. And so making sure that we don't lose those narratives and those stories and that history, and MTPC has been such an important place to collect those over the years.
So our next question is about name change and gender marker changes during this time. How do people go about that?
I'm happy to speak to that. Yeah, I mean, it's been a real challenge because of the courthouse closures for people to get kind of ordinary and common legal work done. But with that said, GLAAD has maintained a name and gender marker change project and is in collaboration with two law firms, Ropes and Gray and Goodwin, to make available to anyone who needs one a free lawyer to file, well, both to advise folks around name and gender marker changes and also to help people file and navigate the court system. And that project continues to be up and running. I know there's a link in the chat about it. There's certainly delays at this point in time, and the court closures are pretty location specific. And there are some courts that are doing a better job than others of both receiving and acting on online filings. I mean, for example, New Hampshire is receiving all online filings. The situation is more scattershot in Massachusetts. There still is the opportunity to mail in some of the documents, and there are some courthouses at the moment that are more accessible than others. So it's been a dynamic situation, and it's been changing really week to week, but the GLAAD's name and gender marker project is ongoing, and I would urge people to reach out and get into that project because there have been some delays in moving those forward, but it's absolutely still operating. And the information, I mean, there's also a reference guide that kind of allows people to navigate the systems through themselves, but that does require then reaching out to individual courthouses to see what the process is, both for filing and for following up on those court proceedings. But please reach out to GLAAD if anyone has kind of more specific questions or issues that they face, particularly with the courthouse closures.
And there's actually a follow-up question to that came in through the RSVP, which is, how do I get a Massachusetts driver's license when my Mass birth certificate and Connecticut's driver's license has an X for sex? If I can't, what will happen if I lie and put down M or F for my sex?
So I guess on that specific a question, I would really urge someone to reach out to GLAAD Answers. I would tell, anyway, it sounds like a more individual specific request for both information and guidance. So I'd urge you to reach out to GLAAD Answers, and we can try to provide you the information, the most accurate information on that.
Okay, just looking through the chat if there are any other questions.
I just did see, Tre'Andre, I did see in the chat that somebody said they had a name change done telephonically in Connecticut. I'm happy to hear about that. And that's, you know, just the kind of like specific navigation that people need to work through. And there are kind of all different creative solutions that are being offered now throughout New England and across the country in this time. So it's great to hear that. And I appreciate knowing that as well.
That's awesome. Okay. Okay, going to questions from RSVP. Let's see. Where can I get face feminization surgery where my insurance will be accepted?
So I can speak a little bit to this question. It is dependent on what your insurance is and what medical providers are in network with your insurer, right? So that's sort of the first level of inquiry. You know, what is your insurance plan and what's in network? Now, I would say there are not enough surgeons that are doing this work, quite frankly, both in Massachusetts, but all over the country. You know, there are certainly some, but I think we will see in the future more who are doing this and who really do it quite well. That said, there are some in the, in the Boston area I know about. I know that Mass General Hospital has a surgeon doing this. I know Mount Auburn Hospital has a surgeon who's doing these surgeries. I'm not sure if Boston Medical Center still has a surgeon who's doing this. There are some issues with taking insurance for that surgeon. I'm not sure about Cooley, Dickinson, or yeah, I'm sure Aleah could answer that question about Cooley.
We have so a lot of the providers for Cooley Dickinson are affiliated with the hospital, but not necessarily like in the hospital. But there's a doctor named Dr. Allcroft in Northampton who's doing some facial surgery. And then we have a doctor named Dr. Topal, who's a plastic surgeon who does not, to my knowledge, specialize in FFS, but is a general plastic surgeon who has done a lot of work with the trans community around top surgeries and reconstructive surgeries. So I would guess if there was something she felt she could do, she would do it. But we've been also referring folks from our part of the woods, if they have Mass Health, out to the Boston area, to the providers out there.
One of the issues is that up until a certain point in time, facial feminization or facial reconstruction surgeries have been denied by many insurance plans. My organization has actually represented a number of people and were able to get approvals from Mass Health. And Mass Health actually changed its policy and now is covering facial reconstruction surgeries, which is great. That said, there's still a dearth of providers, and not all of the providers that do the surgery accept insurance. I don't think Dr. Allcroft accepts Mass Health. I'm pretty sure he doesn't, although I think he may accept some other insurance plans. So there is really a lack of access in terms of the provider side. We see that also when it comes to other kinds of gender affirming surgeries, unfortunately. I do think, and this is kind of cold comfort on some level, but in the future, there will be more and more. But right now, there aren't enough.
And I just wanted to add in the Connecticut Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities just issued a decision that said insurance plans can't specifically deny procedures, including procedures like FFS for transgender people. And so, I mean, Andrew's totally right. We are not seeing the level of providers available for folks who both need the services and would even potentially have coverage for it. But hopefully, as there are more and more decisions like that and interpretations of those exclusions, recognizing them to be discriminatory targeting of the community, that there will hopefully be more access and more providers too, but not a short-term solution, but an important decision from the CHRO recently.
And I think where the insurance goes, usually that's where people's practices follow. So I agree that I'm sure there will be more people offering. I think that then that's where the community part comes in handy, because they're often, when people start doing surgery for reimbursement reasons, you can have sort of some questionable outcomes or questionable motivations to do surgery. So I think that the community usually has done a very good job of kind of vetting people for each other. And I think that as more surgeons come out doing more things, that's going to still be needed.
So we are approaching 6:40, and I want to be very mindful of people's time. And so I think we're actually going to close it out now. We're not going to, I don't know if we have time for one last question, which is, what are the safe Zoom or phone support groups for LGBTQI+ POC in the Boston area? And I think there was, maybe in terms of that, there's a virtual, a list of virtual support groups. I don't know in terms of them being great for folks, for POC folks, but the list is in the chat, and you can access that virtually. Other than that, I'm not really sure of some specific POC groups in the area, phone groups in the area. other than what Fenway is offering. So there are also some other questions that we weren't able to get to during our Q&A. If we weren't able to get to your questions, we'll do our best to follow up with you privately, individually, so that we are able to answer your questions. And I want to thank our presenters, Jennifer, Andrew, Aleah, and folks at GLAAD for really getting the logistics together for this. I think we might be looking at maybe hosting something similar, but more so on a New England scale. We'll see, we'll see. Thank you, folks. I hope you have a great rest of your evening, and you feel free to message us, follow up with us individually if you have any other questions or concerns. Take care.
Thank you so much to everybody for joining. It's clearly, you know, a need for this conversation, so thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Yes.
Really appreciate it.
Take care, everyone. Be well.